Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. This is Madiha Zahir from Department of Zoology, Bank Road Campus, University of Education, Lahore. So students, today we are going to discuss another topic of our course, Evolution and Principles of Systematics, and that is the speciation. Now, what is speciation? How could it take place? And what are the modes of speciation? What is the actual requirement of the speciation? What is the theory related to speciation? All we're going to talk about in today's lecture. So we're going to talk about the introduction of speciation and requirement, and we're going to talk about the two modes of speciation, and rest of the two modes we will be discussing in our second part of this lecture. Now let's start our topic, that is the speciation. Okay, first of all, let's have the introduction of the speciation, that what is speciation. Speciation is the formation or the production of the new species. So formation of the new species is called speciation. Now, what is the species? Here we have taken the most accepted definition of the species, that is the biological definition or biological concept of the species. The species is a group of individuals that are capable of interbreed with each other and produce fertile offsprings. So, the formation of new species is called speciation, and species is the group of individuals which I have just told you. But what happened? Question arises here that how does speciation takes place? Of course, there are many changes in the existing species that ultimately leads to the formation of the new species. New species will definitely arise from the pre-existing individuals or pre-existing species. So this is but one thing keep in your mind, the speciation is not at all a fast process. It is a process of it is a very gradual, very slow process. It takes years or hundreds of years for an existing species to become a new species. Now here we are going to talk about the requirement of the speciation. What is the exact or main requirement for a species to become a new species is what? This is the reproductive isolation. When individuals are prevented from interbreed, individuals of subpopulation. Now, if we talk about the population of humans, then we have the Pakistan population, we have American population. These are known as the subpopulation of the humans. So, when the individuals of the subpopulations are prevented, are not allowed to mate with individuals of other subpopulation, then ultimately this is called the reproductive isolation. So this ultimately leads to the formation of the new species. Once the individuals or subpopulation is reproductively isolated, then what will happen? Then the natural selection on that population and the genetic drift. Genetic drift is a topic that you have already studied in your previous lectures, will takes place, and evolution, this will lead to the evolution of the existing species and ultimately leads to the new species. Okay, what happens sometimes that there are the groups that are evolutionarily related to each other, or that are the relatives of each other in terms of the evolution, but sometimes they are present close to each other geographically, and sometimes they are geographically disconnected. They are not connected with each other. Some groups of the same population live at east, suppose at east part of the sphere, and some at the west. So there are many geographical barriers between the organisms, between the group of organisms. So the organisms or group of organisms that are related evolutionary but that are not connected geographically. You know that every population shares a particular gene pool. Now, what is gene pool? Gene pool is a complete set of genes. So every population has a particular gene pool. But when the groups of that main population get separated, get disconnected from the main population, so they cannot meet each other, with the passage of time, with years and years after years, they have there will be a change in their gene pool, that separated group. So ultimately that group will lead to the speciation, of course, because that particular group has a different environment, and they are not that they cannot share their gene pool with that of the main population because of the reproductive isolation. So ultimately they will lead to the speciation. Large geographical barriers such as oceans and mountains, here deserts also, and glaciers also isolate populations from one another and establish conditions that can facilitate the development of considerable differences among the separated groups, right? Now the ways in which the reproductive isolation takes place. There are the majorly two ways, pre-mating and post-mating, but these two different kinds of reproductive isolation you have comprehensively studied in your previous lecture of isolation, right? So here I'm just going through briefly through these two ways, just to make you memorize the ways of the reproductive isolation which you have already studied in the topic of the isolation. So pre-mating isolation is one type of reproductive isolation, and the other is a post-mating. Pre means something that is before, that is previous. So, and post is something after. So pre-mating isolation is definitely the isolation that stops or that prevents the mating from taking place. This is what is known as the pre-mating isolation. Isolation have been taken place before mating. For example, as we talked in our previous slides about the impenetrable barriers, about the physical barriers such as rivers and mountains, they separate the subpopulations, and definitely the members of the subpopulation could not meet each other, and once they could not meet each other, they cannot mate with each other. So this is one way of the pre-mating isolation. Other forms of the pre-mating isolation are more subtle. Why? Because there is a difference in the mating patterns or courtship behavior of the two animals. And they are not mutually appropriate. When they are not mutually appropriate means they are not compatible each other. When the individuals are not compatible each other no more, then they cannot mate. Mating could not occur. Similarly, individuals with different breeding periods. If a group of individuals that has a breeding period in the summer, and the same species and the group of individuals of the same species that breeds in winter, so the individuals could not mate with each other, of course, because they have the different breeding periods. They could mate only those individuals that have the same breeding period. Summer breeders mate the summer breeders, and winter breeders definitely will mate the winter breeders. So this is type of the pre-mating isolation. Though the individuals belong to the same species, same population, but because of the difference in the breeding time or breeding period or breeding seasons or different habitats, they cannot mate with each other. So these are the four main aspects of the pre-mating isolation. Pre mean before. Okay, the second type of the reproductive isolation is the post-mating isolation. Pre-mating was the before the mating, that prevents the mating from being take place. But post-mating isolation, of course, here the mating has been taken place, but it will prevent the fertilization and sometimes the proper development, proper production of the functional fertile offspring. So this is the post-mating isolation, where isolation have taken place, but fertilization development is incomplete, or it will not be successful. For example, sometimes what happened, the female reproductive tract could not support the sperm. When the conditions in the reproductive tract could not support the sperm, then the sperm cannot successfully fertilize the egg. So mating has been taken place, but fertilization couldn't take place, right? Sometimes fertilization takes place, mating takes place, fertilization takes place, but the offspring that have been produced, that is sterile, that is infertile, that cannot reproduce, that cannot have its own offsprings. So this is also known as the post-mating isolation. Here I have given a very common example of mule. You know, mule is the mating product of the female horse and the male donkey. Female horse, you know, the feminine of horse is mare. So it is a mating product of the male donkey and a mare. Here the organism is very apparently it is developed and it is good, but what happened, it is sterile, it cannot reproduce. Once it cannot reproduce, it means that it cannot have its own offspring. So this is what the post mating isolation. Here isolation has taken place, here fertilization has taken place, but here the offspring that is the result of the mating is sterile. Sometimes of course we are talking about the post mating isolation, then mating has taken place, but what happened, fertilization successful, but after fertilization, during fertilization, the meiosis couldn't take place well, and this will lead to the mismatched chromosomes cannot properly synapse during the meiosis, and ultimately the gametes could not viable and could not developed into an offspring. Other kinds of post-mating isolation include developmental failures of the fertilized egg or the embryo. So these were the two main kinds of the reproductive isolation, which is a very important requirement of the speciation. Modes of speciation. So we are going to discuss different modes of speciation on geographical basis. We will be discussing allopatric speciation, sympatric speciation, and parapatric speciation. But most important are the allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. Parapatric speciation have been proven theoretically, but there is no as such different evidences available for the parapatric speciation. So before going to the modes of the speciation, first we have to discuss the theory of the geographic speciation. Let's read it. In sexually reproducing animals, a new species develops when a population that is geographically isolated from the other population of its parental species acquires during this period of isolation characters that promote or guarantee reproductive isolation after the external barriers break down. Now what this theory states, that once a group of organisms or a subpopulation has been separated or isolated from its parental species, either because of the barriers or any other reason, now what happened, that separated population will be subjected to different environment, different selection pressures, including environment, habitat, different kinds of mutations. So after a long period of time, even the barriers break, they can unite with their parental population, but still because they have been subjected through different selection pressures, they have acquired the characteristics that still make them reproductively isolated from the main or parental population. It doesn't mean that once the population or a group of individuals or a subpopulation, any word you can use, is separated geographically, and after millions of years, if barriers break and this population get back to the main population, could interbreed. Now this separated or isolated population could not interbreed with the main population according to this theory, because the separated group have been gone through different selection pressure and they have acquired different characteristics. Now they are no more compatible to the original population or parental population. So this was the theory of geographic speciation. Now we are going to discuss different modes of speciation on the basis of geographical factors. Okay, the first mode of speciation on geographical basis is the allopatric speciation. Again, the word allopatric is being derived from the Greek language. Allos mean other and patra mean fatherland. So what happened here? The subpopulation are getting isolated or separated from the main population or from the fatherland because of the some external physical geographical barriers. These barriers could be rivers, it could be mountain, it could be ocean, it could be deserts, it could be glacier, etc., etc., right? So when these subpopulation are isolated, speciation takes place. After millions of years, it got completed. Let's read. It occurs when subpopulations become geographically isolated from one another. This is what allopatric speciation, or speciation that depends on an external barrier to gene flow to begin or complete the process of speciation. So this kind of speciation or this kind of formation of the new species depend on the external barrier. There must be some external barrier that separates, that does not allow the subpopulations to meet, that prevents the gene flow. What is the gene flow? Gene flow is the transfer of genetic variations or genes from one population to the other population of the same species, right? So for example, if you take a very general example of gene flow, suppose there is a bee that feed on the nectar of a flower, right? This bee takes pollen with it, or a wind takes pollen with it from one population of the flowers and drops the pollen to the other population of flowers. So in this way, genes are being flowing from one population to the other population. If the gene flow is very high, gene flowing is taking place at a high rate, so ultimately the both population could be considered as a single one population. But to speciation for speciation to occur, there must be external barrier that prevents the gene flow between the subpopulations. Adaptations to different environments or natural selection in these separate populations may result in members not being able to mate successfully with each other, even if experimentally reunited. Once the population, subpopulation, group of individuals have been separated from the main population, then what happened? They will be subjected to different kinds of selection pressure, different mutations, genetic drift, and ultimately they acquire the different characteristics, as we talked in the theory of the geographical speciation. So if after acquiring different characters, these organisms or these members, if we try to unite them experimentally, we cannot do this, because now they have the different characters, they are not compatible. So many biologists believe that this kind of speciation, that is allopatric speciation, is the most common kind of speciation, right? This is the most important kind of speciation that happens in the evolution. Okay, in allopatric speciation, what we do, we predict that population of the same species, but this population is present if at different geographical locations, then ultimately they would acquire difference in they would acquire genetical variations, and ultimately with the passage of time they will be developed into different separate species. Here you can see in this picture that what happened, these are the two owl subspecies. This is the northern spotted owl and this is the Mexican spotted owl. Now these two owl species, their genus is Strix and they belong to the same species Occidentalis, but they are now morphologically and genetically somewhat different from each other. So they have been divided into two subspecies, Corina and Lucida. This is the Corina, and this is the Lucida. Now here we are predicting that these two subspecies of the owl that are geographically isolated, and ultimately with the millions of years they become too much different from each other after subjecting to the selection pressures, that they will be developed into different species, right? Let's read. Spotted owl subspecies living in different geographical locations show some genetic and morphological differences. Morphological differences that you can see in the apparently differences in the structures. This observation is consistent with the idea that new species form through geographic isolation, right? What happened in the isolation? We make hypotheses, then we make observations, hypothesis, and then we looked for the different evidences, and ultimately we reach to the conclusion. Because evolution is a very slow process, one cannot see evolution with his eyes in his life, right? So we are predicting here that ultimately may this owl species will be two subspecies will be geographically has been geographically isolated, but will be much more different in future and ultimately become incompatible for mating and become the entirely different species. Okay, a very well-known example of the allopatric speciation is the Darwin finches. We have studied and talked a lot about the Darwin finches in our various topics like Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection. There we have talked about the Darwin finches. How they are allopatric how they have been gone through the allopatric speciation. Why? Because they have been migrated from the mainland for some reasons. So finches have been distributed on different islands. Now once they have been distributed on different islands, they are geographically isolated from each other. After the isolation on after the migration to the different islands, each finch has been had been subjected to different selection pressures. They have been adapted themselves to whatever available on the islands as their food, whatever the resources were there. So they need to be adapted themselves to make their life continue, right? So with the millions of years, with the passage of the time, they have gone through different selection pressures. They have adapted like mainland finches were mostly were the seed eaters. Now after the distribution, after the geographical isolation, they some got adapted to the to have their food as the cactus plants or cactus flowers. Some feed on cactus plants. So their got differences in their structure, in their length, in their shape of their basically in the shape of their beaks. So this will ultimately leads to the allopatric speciation. This is very authentic, very solid example of the allopatric speciation. Now let's read it. A well-known example of allopatric speciation is Darwin finches. Ancestor finches having emigrated from the mainland probably were distributed among a few islands of Galapagos. Combined forces of isolation, mutation, and natural selection, right? Once they have isolated, then they have undergone through natural selection, different mutational pressures, and allowed the finches to diverge into a number of species with specialized feeding habits. Now what the special change they got after distribution? The change in their eating, in their food resources, right, in their feeding habits. Of the 14 species of the finches, 6 have beaks specialized for crushing seeds of different sizes. Others feed on flowers of prickly pear cactus or in the forest on insects and fruit. Now, according to the availability of the type of the food, they have been adapted and ultimately they have been developed into a different species, and they are no longer be compatible to the finches of the mainland. They have been reproductively isolated and finally forms the new species. So this is called allopatric speciation. Why? Because here the speciation have been take place because of the geographical barrier. Okay, here is another mode of speciation, and that is the peripatric speciation. Peripatric speciation also takes place because of the geographical barriers, right? You can say that it is a specialized version or form of the allopatric speciation, because both kinds of speciations, allopatric and peripatric, have been taken place because of the geographical barrier. But difference is only that in case of the allopatric, in case of the peripatric speciation, only very limited number of individuals have been geographically isolated, right? So this is the main difference between the peripatric and allopatric speciation. In allopatric speciation, a major group of population has been isolated, geographically isolated, but in case of the peripatric speciation, only a limited number of individuals have been moved to some place, and there would be then isolated because of the geographical barriers. Now let's read it. Peripatric speciation is a special version of the allopatric speciation mode and happens when one of the isolated populations has a very few individuals, right? Here you can also see in this diagram that this is the original population. Only a very few number of individuals have been geographically isolated, and ultimately with the passage of time, after subjecting to the selection pressures, they have been isolated, reproductively isolated, and have been developed into a new species. The isolated populations may undergo shifts in their gene frequencies under the influence of the genetic drift. Now, this peripatric speciation you can easily understand when you have the concept of the founder's effect. In founder's effect in genetic drift lecture, you have talked about and you read about, studied about the founder's effect. Then genetic drifts have two kind of effects. One is the bottleneck effect and other is the founder's effect. And what happened in founder's effect, a few individuals have been migrated from the main population to some other regions, and there they have found a new population. They make their own population, right? So this will this will lead to the change in the gene frequencies. So there will be different gene frequencies in the founder population and in the main population. Same happens in the peripatric speciation. In peripatric speciation, few individuals have been isolated geographically and they have undergone different pressures, and their gene frequencies change under the influence of the which effect? Founder's effect, right? So this is most likely to occur if new population rise from the new founder individuals and no gene flow occurs between the isolates and the main population. Once the few individuals have been isolated, there will be gene flow will be ceased. There will be no exchange of gene flow between the isolated population, isolated individuals, and the main population. Ultimately, this will lead to the formation of the new species, and this process is known as the peripatric speciation, right? Okay, students, today we have talked about two modes of speciation, that is the allopatric speciation and peripatric speciation. These are the versions of the same type of speciation, but there was a little difference. Thank you so much. Take care of yourselves, and hopefully, inshallah, see you in the second part of the same lecture. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.